to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Rik Storey to discuss, is Christianity feministic or patriarchal? Tim?
I think there's three ways you could frame this. Are women better than men? Are men better than women? Or are both equally bad? So you've sort of talked about definitions. I would say that in a sense, you have multiple competing definitions of feminism, of course, as with most disputed words. So I'm going to position why I think this is a relevant question within the libertarian as well as the non-normie right movement online. The non-normie right movement is very critical of feminism and feminists and most varieties as well. The so-called con inc right, as what Tom Woods would call the con inc conservative inc, is either on the some version of the feminism train or already there, or just progressive or going the speed limits, Michael Malice would say. I think that's a very correct criticism. So a working definition of feminism is the belief that women ought to have either equal or superior role to men in society in terms of power, rights, prestige, and value. And I say superior because I think sometimes if they say the quiet part out loud, they're not really egalitarians. They are inegalitarians. I think women are actually better than men. And I think I'm going to name some Christians, I think, who get into this idea. So Christianity is one of the key words in here too. And the idea that women are being spirited is personified in idiotic films and TV shows, where the female character is imposed and the male character is like a loser, an incel, so to speak. And again, I have some first-hand experience of the kind of, pro-women, like women are the best type thing. I've worked in a mainstream corporation. I've been through American University. I don't know if you read this Scott Adams thing, but one of Scott Adams, the guy of Dilbert, also said is, he was basically told that they're not hiring any white men at the job. The men, the second half part of the job. So those kind of hiring initiatives, they are to a certain extent real. But this is also included by the Christians. So take David Bentley Hart and Brian Zahnd. There are two names. David Bentley Hart is probably more famous, but Zahnd has a bit of a reputation too. And if you ask them, they would say they're egalitarians. But at times in interviews, they almost go into like male bashing mode, where they'll say, "Oh, certain Christians, certain key Christians might have been women," or so to speak. And even when interviewed, some other ones will get on the train. So I would say the dissident right online movement is doing, funnily enough, the liberal thing by going after the unequal treatment men get in society here. So in a sense, I wish they were egalitarians. So that would be the minimum thing. One of the principal claims which the originators of certain right-wing people made, in particular Nietzsche, who was single all of his life, is that Christianity is a slave religion, a religion of weak people. And it raised this, and by doing that, it raised the status of women. And this is sort of like the first feminist revolution here in the first century here. Because under Patrius Familia, the male patrician owned the women and children, so to speak, in the household here. So in this sense, Unwin, Unwin's a great book. He wrote books, Sex and Culture. Now, so what Unwin actually says he thinks is the ideal, or is in this sense, he's more like Vilfredo Pareto in the sense he's just describing things here. But I'd say that the extent that he's describing things, he's describing that Christianity, to some extent, feminized, in particularly Protestant, as well as earlier Catholic societies compared to Roman societies. So this is where the very first feminist revolution happened. Women were given at least some form of rights. They weren't viewed merely as property or chattel of their husband. And writers like Hart and others would take to say, well, now we only need to expand this. So that's that. So I think today we got into the point where we've downloaded a lot of different ideas, which maybe 50 years ago were still at least latently there in the background. And we've sort of discussed this in why do people have children? We've sort of discussed this. Shweta and I discussed this in our some of our episodes on family as well as sex. There's certain ideas which used to be taken for granted, now have to be reasoned, or if anything, the opposite is now true. So women are, by default position, are viewed to work. By default, people just view everyone as being created equal here. Christians too. And people like Hart are popular in the mainstream church, at least certain versions of it. So So I do think there's a certain air of plausibility that Christianity created the first wave of feminism in the first century. Whether it created the second, third, and the other later waves and incarnations, as people like Sean Gabb and Murray Rothbard would point out, in the early days of like the progressive movement, the Christian like when women got the right to vote in like Western societies, France, England, United States, it was a very the Christian suffragette movement was very Christian by definition here, and they wanted to get the right to vote to take away vices too. There's a certain strangeness about that, where they want to take out alcohol. As Thaddeus Russell would joke, the first thing women did when they got the right to vote is ban liquor in the United States, at least. Now, Sean Gabb also said something I think is interesting, and I've discussed this with Natty. As terms of the power elite, I'd still say, if people ask me, like, is society patriarchal or feminist? I've just made, as using the Scott Adams example, I just made an argument to say that in certain levels, it's actually harmful to men. Well, in other areas, I'd say that the power elite is still mostly men. Keith Preston, in that interview, pushed back on Gabb a little bit on that, but not really to a certain extent. The elite that don't get named, I would guess, are mostly men. So maybe that is still the case here. So if people ask me, is society feminist? I'm going to say, well, I don't know. The power elite still seems, to a large extent, Ubermensch type males in that sense. So I've outlined the case here that Christianity has some role in creating some things which today exist. In more, in earlier days, only distant like in utero, but now it's more fully fledged out here. So like right to vote. Both own property, males and females can own property, and so forth. And now they're all sort of like, everyone is granted those rights here. And I'd say they originate in Christianity. Some normie Christians say, yeah, we're the true liberals here. And that's a maneuver that a lot of, for example, N.T. Wright will do that maneuver here. He's a sort of voice in some form of the mainstream church, at least online, at least in certain places here in the English world. So Rik and Swithin, what do you make of my case here? We'll start with Rik here. One of the things I would say is that, like, once you I'll continue on with my question before I let you speak, try to ramble on here, is that, like, one of the down products of, like, being online is, you become aware of movements like the dissident right, like the men's rights movement, and then it changes your view on, like, marriage, for example, like, if as well as, like, the mainstream church here, it's like, well, who's exactly exploiting whom here? And it sort of raises awareness. It's a very annoying word, but in a sense, that's what it does by product here. So sometimes conservatives will give the advice to get married, but then they also know that there's kangaroo courts and other things that there. So that's somewhat of a side issue. But I do think there's an air of plausibility that when certain pagan people would say that they created it. Now, what you think of the creation of that is up to you. You could think it is a good thing, and that's the maneuver that the N.T. Wrights and David Bentley Harts will do. So, Rik, I'll start with you. What do you think of the case that Christianity created it, and what do you think of my opening statement here?
Yeah, I think you've raised all of the important things that we're probably going to discuss here, Tim, and I think you've helpfully defined kind of broadly what feminism is, and so that's given us some direction here. I think probably, if people want to go away and read like what I think is quite a definitive case of saying Christianity granted greater rights to women and children, and this effectively invented the individual in our modern liberal context. What we would understand as an individual was a book called Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism by Larry Siedentop. So if you want to learn some more there, you can go and read Inventing the Individual, and you'll get a good idea of what it is that we're debating about here. But I find that people say, Christianity kind of feminized Europeans, and they were ever so rugged and manly before, and this has then been the cause, of a steady decline into modern liberalism. it's oversimplistic, and to my mind, it just doesn't work. I think they're basically just anti-Christian, and they've sort of latched onto some ideas of maybe Nietzsche, who you've already mentioned, Tim, or maybe Edward Gibbon, who wrote the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he wanted to blame Christianity for that. I mean, it's basically been debunked. Edward Gibbon's ideas. It's way too simplistic. It doesn't apply to Eastern Rome, and I don't want to go into all of that. But my point is that it's way too oversimplistic. I mean, an obvious example that comes to mind of how Christianity seemed to have, if anything, maybe reduced the public role of women in the Greek-speaking world of Europe and Asia Minor in the earliest days of Christianity, even the first century, even in the New Testament, can be seen where, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he is saying that women are to wear head coverings in church. And also, and you see this in his letters to Timothy as well, he says that women should not preach, or especially in the church in Corinth, they shouldn't even speak during the church service, and they should save any questions they have to ask their husband at home. Now, this is something that I've, myself, when I've been in conversation with women who identify as feminists, that they'll bring this up and they'll say, well, look how destructive Christianity has been to women's rights. Look at what St. Paul was saying here. So on the one hand, we have people saying Christianity has feminized Europe and indeed the world too much. I mean, on the other hand, if I'm speaking to feminists, they might point to parts of the New Testament and say, look at how it was introducing some tyrannical patriarchy. Now, the church in Corinth, these were certain... The people who were going to these churches may have otherwise been going to pagan temples where there would have been a temple prostitute. Very often, these women would have shaved their heads, and basically there would be some sort of ritual where you would end up having sex with this temple prostitute, for whatever reason, according to their religion. So, the people were coming from that, and they were coming to a religion that had, a much more, shall I say, Eastern, patriarchal Hebrew flavor to it, where, women had a very specific role. It was very familial. And so, look, right there in the New Testament, we see the case that, Christianity is, if anything, introducing patriarchal elements and a certain level of control over women. Indeed, the head covering is supposed to represent that the women in the church are married and that they have the authority of their husband over them. So, I mean, I just immediately want to start with that. It's not so simple. Just on the face of it, it is not so simple to say Christianity necessarily feminized Europeans or something like that. It's an oversimplification. Now, in terms of what did Christianity actually do then? So Christianity introduced this equity in that men and women, and yes, children, all have an individual soul for which, they are responsible before God. So in terms of how that affects jurisprudence in, Western law, in the history of Western law, this made it so that, that the dignity of that had to be respected. And so, a classic example of this will be that in the marriage vows, in Christian marriage, a woman will have a vow. She is asked, do you accept this person as your husband? And she can say no. She's not being bought and sold. She's not a chattel. That her father would sell her off. Now, may that still have happened? In fact, perhaps so. But the ideal and the way that's affected the culture and affected Western jurisprudence is that men and women have a spiritual equality and a dignity before God because they have an individual soul. Now, that's it. It's not to say anything necessarily about how to define a woman biologically. You're not going to find that necessarily in the Bible or in the Catechism. And quite frankly, I don't think you really need to say anything about that. But what you can say is that Christianity introduced this idea of individual souls, and that's affected law, and that's affected culture in the West. Now, did that lead to the rise of modern liberalism? That's then the crux here. And did that lead to the rise of this very individualistic, perhaps even egoistic idea of a woman that we see now, where, for instance, you have this great debate, now going on where, some people are siding with J.K. Rowling because she wants to defend a, strictly biological definition of what a woman is. And on the other hand, you have, people who use sort of, maybe you call them woke or something like that. And they have a much more egoistic idea of what a woman is. So they might say, okay, even though someone has been, biologically they're born as a male, they might, feel as though they have, really they're a woman, but on the inside, in terms of their ego or maybe their soul or something like that, or, they just want to be identified as a woman. Now, has Christianity necessarily led to this, or to any form of feminism, where we're talking about something more akin maybe to J.K. Rowling, or to this other view we're looking at, or to earlier forms of feminism where it was simply about women want to be able to choose to vote, for instance, so they want to have a greater public voice, a political standing, a political voice, and that sort of thing. Or, they want to be able to engage in freely whatever profession they want to without being discriminated against, and that sort of thing. I think that is strictly born out of modern liberalism. And I do see that as being a distinct departure from this Christian idea of individuals having souls which have equal dignity. I do see that as a departure. And I don't know whether either of you want to jump in before I discuss why I see this modern liberal individual idea and how that formed feminism as being very distinct from this Christian idea of individual souls. Perhaps you might want to jump in before I go on any further.
Well, what I was going to say was, whilst I do think it's distinct from the idea of equally valuable individual souls, it does seem to me to be the case that the form in which we get feminism today is only something that would be an outgrowth of a Christian society. It is not something you would have got in this particular form, and the way in which it develops if it had been a pre-Christian one or a non-Christian one. I just don't see it being developed the way that it has. Now, you could argue that you've had a similar sort of feminism generated to some extent, popularized in, say, Eastern and Japan, but that's really due to American cultural hegemony, which is, of course, largely post-Christian. One other thing as well, Rik, before Tim, want to jump in after this, is what something I found interesting, as Tim mentioned, J.D. Unwin, and I'll make a few quotes from him, is that it does seem to be the case that you could argue there's sort of proto-feminism prior to of sorts. Well, it's not really feminism, but a higher, depends how I want to talk about the term feminism, but a higher social status of women, even in Athens. And this was even, Nietzsche wouldn't like this, this was prior to even Socrates. So a couple of quotes come in there. So this is on page 388, J.D. Unwin, he quotes, "According to Aristotle, the early Hellenes bought their wives, and Boschert considers the purchase succeeded capture as a prevailing custom. The bride was sold to her husband's family by her guardian, who might be her father, brother, or nearest male relative. She was regarded as a child producer and a housekeeper. If she were guilty or even suspected of adultery, her husband had no option. Society compelled him to put her away. An adulteress was a social outcast and liable to suffer any insult, however violent, which stopped short of murder. A man's children were looked upon as his personal property and were not legal entities." End quote. So that's in the early Hellenistic period. He doesn't give particular dates, and he continues, quote, "By the beginning of the 6th century, the custom of buying a wife had fallen into disuse among noble families. It had been given. It had become the practice to provide a daughter with a dowry. This did not affect the parental or marital authority, but it acted as a defense against the husband's caprice. For the dowry seems to have remained the property of the wife's people, so if the husband exercised his power of repudiation, he had to restore the dowry. Moreover, he was sometimes required to give collateral security that the property would pass to his wife's children." End quote. Page 389, so more development of this sort of higher status, as it were. So page 389, quote, "We have no knowledge of early Athenian law before the end of the 5th century, but it seems that as the noble families became richest, their women became creatures of pomp and vanity, indulging in spendthrift entertainments and nocturnal escapades. In the middle of the 6th century, Solon was appointed dictator to cope with the economic crisis which had arisen. Our knowledge of his reforms is inconsiderable, but according to Plutarch, Solon placed a statutory limit on the amount of money a woman might spend on dress, entertainment, and household furniture. He also enacted that no woman was to carry more than 3 dresses on her travels, and that in future she was not to go abroad at night unless she was accompanied by her attendants." End quote. This does not seem prior to Solon like a society in which women were particularly oppressed in the upper classes and seemed to have significant autonomy. Otherwise, such laws would not have been implemented by Solon, or at least according to Plutarch. So I use this, I find this one of the most interesting parts of Saxon culture, is that it does seem to be the case, contrary to sort of the pagan rite, that there are precursors to higher social status of women, which you could perceive as somewhat proto-feministic. And that's prior to Christianity and, as I say, with the Nietzschean reference, prior to even Socrates. Now, as I said at the beginning, now I do see though the feminism that does, the modern feminism, which you really say starts in the 19th century, really, and there may be some precursors to it, does seem to be a Christian, Christian heresy is probably the best way of putting it. So, Tim or Rik, jump in as you deem fit.
Oh, Rick can go in a minute. I'll just make a quick comment here. Rick's question is about like when is the point of departure occurred? Well, there's a sort of departure point. And one of the arguments I would make, trying to preempt the response here to somewhat, is that to me I see it sort of like a boiling frog, where I just see you can boil a frog easily by just supposedly slowly raising the temperature of something slowly and slowly, slowly. But if you jump in, throw the frog in there, that's sort of the analogy of the boiling frog. But when if there is a departure point or if there's a distinction point, when did it happen, so to speak? Because you could get reports. One of the sort of historical facts is you find is that church attendance, and this is something that's been pointed out, has always been disproportionately women, and even that still runs today. That there are certain writers. Again, we don't have much statistics here, but there's certain historical writers that would make that comment about Catholic Church of olden times as well. And even in the first, second, and third centuries, many of the key converts were women. So there might be just competing strains within Christianity. Some patriarchal, some feminist. It might be impossible to actually glean an actual, But I do sort of want to know, like, what is, if there was a deported torture, what ought to be in the case of the teaching. So, Rik, please continue on your point about that distinction.
Sure, yeah, I will do. Thanks, Tim. First, I just wanted to, agree with you, Swithin. Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the pre-Christian world, or even the pagan world generally, doesn't necessarily have to be pre-Christian. If you look at the cycle of civilizations, of which there is a great deal of work. Studying, even historical sources pre-Christianity, you will see that it's the case that in civilizations that have become very wealthy, women start to take a greater role, have a much greater public voice than they did before, start patronizing the arts and things like that, and having greater political influence, through that medium. Various sorts of things like that. So there's nothing new about women coming to the fore and having a greater political say. If we're going to define feminism in a very broad sense and have it kind of mean that, there's nothing new about that. And certainly, pagan societies were not immune from that. Something else is that Gnosticism, of which I see that modernity and the modern concept of the individual and liberalism, I see it as being very, very similar, if not just a form of Gnosticism. The way it views the ego and all those things I was talking about before, and of course, within Gnosticism, pre-Christianity, you had all sorts of ideas about the androgyny. That's so a sort of being who has transcended his biological identity as a man or woman is in some sense, superior. Ideas like this are not new either, and they're not something that Christianity hasn't had to contend with either. They are very old indeed. And on the other hand, something else I want to point out is that in Islam, and even in Wahhabist Islam, and I have many friends actually who are Wahhabist Muslims, and I have Saudi friends, and they will be very quick to say, "Oh yes, under Islam, under Sharia, women technically had and have more rights than they did under traditional historical Christianity in the Christian world, because a woman could divorce her husband if she so wanted to, and some other things that they will bring up, and they are strictly correct. That is correct. Now, the fact that Islam also shares this idea that men and women have equal souls before God, and it shares all of these other aspects that many want to blame about Christianity. They want to put all of modern feminism, they want to lay all the blame of it at Christianity's feet. Well, why are they not terribly worried that, there's going to be some tremendous feminist outbreak, some kind of fifth wave of feminism is about to totally overrun the Muslim world. Why? What is their reason for believing that this is not the case? I've yet to hear a really good argument. But I would say the actual reason is just because of Islam is predominant in the Middle East, and simply culturally, and for a whole host of reasons, the people from that part of the world are just different to European people, who seem to be very individualistic and have really taken modern liberalism, and they developed it in the first place. Europeans developed modern liberalism and the idea of the modern individual in the first place, and they've really run with it. I think that is quite obviously much more the answer. So to get to what you were asking me there, Tim, okay, so where is this point of departure? How did it come about? What is it? I would say it's that. I would say that it is that European people who are descended from Indo-European nomads who were rather psychopathic. And psychopathy is very heritable. I would say that European people have inherited a much more individualistic disposition. I won't go into it too much. I've written about it in my book, and there's loads of material about it. I could talk about it for ages. We've probably done a show about it at some point, but basically, it's enough to say that Europeans are just generally more individualistic, and Western civilization, it has risen tremendously, and it appears to now be on somewhat of a decline, if it isn't dead, quote unquote, already. And so what can we expect to see from a very individualistic civilization when it's at its tail end? Well, I think you can expect to see that women would exercise a far greater political and public role than they might have done historically. And I think you can expect to see them have much greater legal rights, if not equal, or perhaps even superior legal rights compared to men. And you can expect it to be extremely individualistic, more than has been seen from, let's say, other civilizations where the other people are not so inclined towards, individualism. And that is indeed what we see. Is that a departure from Christianity? I think it most definitely is. Well, why? Because these things arose as a very definite departure from Christianity. It is a departure from the Christian idea of what a man and woman are in terms of their God-given roles, where they are, they are one. They come together as one, as a husband and wife, to help each other and to perform different roles. And Christianity is extremely holistic and corporatist, and so it views the family as being a specific corporate entity. And what is a woman? It's somebody performing that role of helping the husband and being a mother within a family unit. So that's kind of the Christian conception of a woman. It doesn't even. It's a complete departure then to say, well, you have an individual who chooses their own purpose for life and is, maybe not at all a part of some corporate whole or a part of some family or, something like that. and has some kind of political autonomy as well. These things are definitely a departure from the Christian idea of a woman and the role of a woman, and also they arose with liberalism, which is a definite political departure from Christianity and Christendom, political Christendom. That's what it was. It was a political rupture. It was separating from any political authority that Rome and the Catholic Church may have had over countries, and it was born out of that. So how then people say, oh well, these are two sides of the same coin, or this is simply an earlier form of that. I just don't get it. They seem to be two completely different things, and one was a definite departure. Modern liberalism is a definite departure from Christendom, and I simply can't see it any other way. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm waiting for the argument.
I suppose one argument might be that actually early Christianity, I suppose you could go Reformation-y. You could argue that in the Reformation period, in trying to get back to sort of the purity of the early church, which isn't necessarily entirely a fair characterization of various goals of the Reformation, you could argue in certain things that Jesus says that, and this is something Tim might want to elaborate on how you need to hate your if you do not hate your father and brother, you cannot be my disciple. And you could argue that certainly less so with Paul, although to some extent with Paul, more so with the Gospels, you could argue there's a downplaying of family relative to, say, the Jewish culture or the prevailing Hellenistic and Roman cultures. And in a way, you could treat it more like, well, it's what matters is your role as a disciple of Jesus and being in his kingdom as a single disciple apart from any of the group. Now, of course, you might be in the church, but then, if you wanted to, you could go, well, Paul says there is neither Jew, no Greek, no slave, nor free, nor male and female in the church. And so from that, if you were to take that view from there, you might think that there's a more sort of individualistic or individualist, depending which you're going to say, version of Christianity, which is sort of hidden or sort of glossed over in the early medieval period or whatever. And so really you want to go back to this more sort of egalitarian view of Christianity. Tim, would you like to comment on that? Because I know this is something you've mentioned to me before.
I guess the question is, what is the real, would the real Christianity please stand up? And then whatever that is the case, that ought to be the case, if indeed Christianity is true, because there is disputes over, like, you get into disputes over, like, what is the particular issues, and this is where the modern day defenders of, like, for example, women becoming ministers would say, well, this was just a particular Corinthian issue at the time, and this was, the real gospel is something the opposite of that. That was just a concession made to the times, and you get into these debates here, and it's like, Walter Block would say when two Austrians fight, Milton Friedman would comment, like, the Austrians would fight, they had to duel because they don't have a way to resolve logical disputes here. Well, Walter Block would say there's no other way to check the logic disputes here. So, like, the certain question here, like, when you get into these debates, over what direction should churches take on these issues is a sort of very real and very live question for many people here. And I still say there's sort of the dog that doesn't bark, that hasn't barked yet. Although a guest from the Tom Woods show did say that there is always a threat that the Catholic Church does ordain women as ministers here. So that dog hasn't barked yet, but it very well could bark. It is in theory plausible. Now you would say, well, maybe it's a priori plausible because that would just be, but you do. It's not. I don't. To take a Graham Oppie view on plausibility here, it is at least you could think of it, you could imagine it, and so the question to me is always, what is the real position here? Because and as far Rik made some comments on Islam here, I'd say, well, that doesn't surprise me here, because you could just say, well, maybe it's all the major Abrahamic monotheisms all sort of have this sneaky individualism built in here. That's actually one way. That's one way out of it. And I suspect that there's a sort of reversion of the future where, and I actually already seen the proto versions of this, where certain conservative Islamic men and certain conservative Catholics get in line with each other against modernists. You see that happening in Michigan over about schools. So maybe just all the major Abrahamic monotheisms have certain shared values. And the question is that one of those shared values individualism? There is a lot of overlap between them. Of course, one group has to be wrong. Why the Jews have to be wrong, the Muslims have to be wrong, or the Christians have to be wrong. One of those guys is a liar. Whether it's Paul, whether it's Muhammad, who knows? There's one, but what is the true version of it? And then going forward, what version should be taken here in our current day? Because there is, of course, historical questions. Maybe it is the case that the Hellenes were, basically no different than modern day, London. Maybe that is the case. That could very well be the case. Although, of course, you could say, and I think a good writer would say that, well, Aristotle has a huge influence on Christian teaching via Thomas Aquinas. Supposedly, Islam also has a big teaching of Aristotle too. So maybe that just crept in through Aristotle as well as Plato. So the Hellenes are just proto-Christian culture. So that would be my response here. What is the true version here? You could argue over the past and the departure points. What would you say is the true version? Rik?
I suppose it's, very similar to what Swithin was saying before as well, isn't it? Where, Swithin was questioning, the early church's understanding of things, and where Paul, writes, there is no Greek, there's no Jew. So in what sense is Christianity individualistic, and in what sense is it then accepting that there are, biological realities, and that there are, natural groups that form, and, roles, things like that? Well, I would say, okay, where is this sneaky individualism in Abrahamic faiths, or, in Christianity more specifically? Well, I'd say, it is simply to say, well, in what sense are we individual? And it's to say, well, we come into this world in, a certain sense, alone. Our soul is formed, and it's not formed necessarily, by others, by other people. As we grow as a material, biological being, an embodied being, yes, okay, we have to learn a language. We have to, function in this world. We find ourselves to be social animals, and, we're given a culture. And, through dialogue with others, we have all sorts of different concepts that are built in our minds, so that we have a framework with which to function in this world. Okay, so, we're social animals, but spiritually, we come in alone, and when we're going out, we're in a sense alone, a sense sort of naked and alone before the judgment of God. We stand alone before eternity, with everything that we are, that we have been, decisions that we have made. So in a spiritual sense, we are an individual soul. And, this is largely, what I was saying before. Christianity sees us as having an equity before God, because what we share universally is this individual soul, this, what will, remain of us once the physical has been shed. Now, okay, well, but that, when the Apostle Paul is saying, when St. Paul is saying, well, there's no Greek or Jew within the church, you have to also take into account that he's saying things which are very pro-family. Swithin was saying, well, there's some very kind of anti-family, pro-individual statements there. Well, St. Paul, strictly says, that people have to look after their family. If you don't look after your family, you're worse than an unbeliever, is what St. Paul says. You have duties towards your family, the way that the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews speaks about his love for his people. And, St. Paul does this elsewhere as well. There's this genuine concern and love for one's people. And this is throughout the Christian tradition, not just Catholic. If you want to go and look at certain specifically orthodox saints as well, and how they interpret the writings from the New Testament and the early fathers, or even if you want to look at the earliest Protestant traditions as well, they understand this quite clearly, that yes, of course, there are biological realities that we're not to reject and we're not to hate. These are God-given things, and they're very good. Ideas such as, we have a people, we're born into a nation, we're born into a family. And these things are precious. It is the highest form of piety. Aquinas says that it's, it is a most pious thing to love one's kind of biological origins, the nation and the family that have given birth to us and nurtured us and given us, all of the mental tools and culture that we need in order to live in this world. The individual aspect is the spiritual aspect. It's the aspect of our soul. That is the Christian tradition. You might say, well, who is right? Because some Christian sects have arisen and may exist even today, which say that you should reject all other influences from other people. You must just read the Bible for yourself, and directly the Holy Spirit will give you, as an individual, the correct understanding of things, and you mustn't allow yourself to be influenced by others. To me, just looking at that on the face of it, doesn't seem like that's really going to go anywhere. It's certainly not going to have much chance of spreading. It's not going to form the kinds of communities that seem to exist in the New Testament, where they're getting together in councils and making decisions about things in the Book of Acts, and where the apostle. Where St. Paul is writing letters to churches and most definitely wants to have an influence on them, and he's advising others to be good influences to each other. And it's certainly not the kind of church that Christ describes, where it's very, very communal, where we're getting together and feasting together and having the mass and partaking of Christ's body and his blood and laughing with each other, weeping with each other. So it just seems very clear to me that we can say, Christianity does not reject anywhere biological realities about our social nature and the kinds of groups that we form. In fact, it affirms them most definitely. If you want to look at the largest denomination, so Catholicism, this is very explicit in the Catechism, so you can see what's very explicitly defined there. So I don't think we really need to say any more than that. There was something else you raised though, Tim, which is, could this kind of evolve over time? For some sects, perhaps yes, I suppose so. For Catholicism, even someone as liberal as the current Pope Francis, he's even had to say explicitly that that there is no possibility of having female priests in the Catholic Church. Might he try and find some other roles, or I think he's tried to toy with the idea of there being female deacons, but then he's had to say that's probably never going to go anywhere. It doesn't seem as though it can. So I don't think that's a possibility either. Something that I actually wanted to raise, I don't want to take the lead or anything, but I think it's also important to understand whether Christianity even can, to what extent Christianity really could feminize a civilization. I interviewed a scholar, long retired now, Stephen Goldberg, and he wrote a book. You're going to have to forgive me, I can't remember the name of it. I think it was I can't remember what it was called. It is something like feminism doesn't exist, or sorry, I remember it now. The inevitability of patriarchy. And his argument was that though women have exercised power roles throughout history, you can think of Catherine in Russia and figures like that, Queen Elizabeth the First, figures like that, Cleopatra, whatever. These situations can never properly be described as anything other than a patriarchy, because as Tim mentioned in passing at the start of this talk, it still seems to be men exercising all of the major power roles, or at least if there is a woman in a power role, her authority is very limited, and she's surrounded by men who seem to be making a lot of the decisions, really. And so he said that this makes it the case that for instance, a society like the bonobo apes, where they are matriarchal, they're completely cut off from chimpanzees, where if they were to encounter a group of chimpanzees, the chimpanzees would literally eat them alive. So because they're cut off, this very unusual little situation can take place where there's a form of matriarchy. But in an open system, and in human civilizations on a grand scale in our increasingly globalized world, he argued that a matriarchy could never exist at all, really. It's not feasible. Even in a situation where you see a declining civilization and women seem to be exercising more of a role. So if that's the case, then, you don't have anything to worry about from Christianity, because it would never amount to anything anyway. I don't know if that derails the conversation too much, but I think it's an important consideration to make. Could we even arrive at a matriarchy at all?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, we did an episode on why do it was to do with, I can't remember the exact title. It was to do with Marxism and feminism, and why if feminists sort of hate corporations so much, why do they work for them? And why do they wish to ascend sort of like the hierarchy at work to a large extent? I think what you could, and I would agree with you with respect to the matriarchy not really being possible. I suppose what is possible is lots of women working for a CEO rather than working for their husband. And insofar as that's possible, which it clearly is, because that's basically the situation you have today, you could declare one sort of feministic to some extent, and the other one patriarchal, although in a sense they're very similar. It's just who they are taking orders from, essentially. So I think that's a possibly interesting way of looking at it. On Christianity, Christianity does have, as you said before, a relatively high view of women, and so it isn't surprising that you could get a sort of heresy going on either side of the golden mean. So I don't think that's entirely surprising. I don't want to go down the Catholic Church can't change its mind, but just one example in which I think it does, although we don't need to debate this on record. It does seem to be the case that the Catholic understanding of salvation outside the Church significantly diverges from the Council of Florence, which basically says nobody outside the Catholic Church can be saved, and there is a radical alteration of that, especially at Vatican II. So now, whether you want to make a distinction, I can't remember the distinctions made, the distinction between development of understanding and development of something else. I can't remember. That does seem to be a distinctly different doctrine. So I would, but again, that's a issue for another day. But I don't think it is immediately obvious that there's only developments within the Catholic Church which are sort of like unfoldings of initial ideas, and they kind of retain their original essence. Because I don't think that's the case with the Council of Florence. But I say that's a bit of a side issue. But yes, finally, I would agree with you that ultimately matriarchies are not possible. And I would just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.